So we're going to we're going to make a 4-flap box, which is this. We use them a lot in archives and library contexts for housing small, fragile materials. They usually work well for things that are up to about 1/2 inch thick. They provide some protection, but they're easy to make. Usually it's one of the first things you'll learn to do in a conservation setting is make a little 4-flap box. They're quick, they're inexpensive in terms of materials, and after some practice you should be able to bang one out in 15 minutes or so. So the things that you need are the object that you're going to make a box for. I'm going to make it for a deck of playing cards because it's small, easy to deal with. We make these boxes out of 20-point board or heavyweight folder stock. It's good quality, acid-free paper. It's heavy enough that it's going to provide protection for your object and easy to work with. As far as tools go, you need a cutting mat, a knife of some sort. I like break-off knives. A bone folder, which is a tool that we will use for making creases. A pencil to mark things. A white plastic eraser, and there are really only 2 acceptable brands of eraser, which are Magic Rub and Statler Mars, which is Staedtler. You can buy them at office supply stores, and they've been chemically tested so that we know that they don't leave behind any damaging residues. And you want a ruler. If you have a cork-backed ruler, you always want to cut with the cork side face up so that any dirt that gets sucked into the cork doesn't transfer to your object. And the last material we're going to use is 3M number 415 double-sided tape, and we'll use that to help put the box together. We're going to make this box by building it around our object, which is really nice because it means you don't have to do any measuring. One of the things we always want to think about is paper grain. When you make machine-made paper, you take paper pulp, distribute it in water, and then essentially pour it out on a conveyor belt that shakes from side to side, and it's made out of screen. All the water falls out, and it becomes a sheet of paper. The result of that is all the paper fibers line up like this, and as they expand and contract in relationship to the moisture in the air, it goes one direction. It expands more this direction than that tall way. And in books and box making, it's traditional that the grain always goes parallel to the spine of the book. That's so that everything is moving the same direction. You don't have a lot of pull between layers. To test paper grain, on 20-point board, it's pretty easy to tell. If you do like this and like this, one way will be decidedly easier to flex, and that's the direction the grain is going. That's the direction you should think about having everything oriented. So on this one, I'm going to flex. This is much easier, so I know that's the grain direction, and I'm going to start there. Like I said, we're going to build this on the box. I'm going to just quickly mark. I want to cut something that's exactly the width of my object. So I'm going to make a couple of pencil marks. The rule of thumb for straight lines is 2 points doesn't necessarily give you a straight line, but if you can get your ruler to go through 3 points, your line will be straight. And then I'm going to just go ahead and cut this. If you're lucky enough to have a board shear, that'll make this go faster, but you can do fine work with just a knife and a ruler. When you're cutting with a knife, you always want to be standing, and you always want to make sure that your blade is sharp. So if you haven't replaced your blade recently, take a second to replace the blade. And you're going to do better if you do several light cuts rather than trying to do one cut to get through this board. I usually have to do 3, 4, sometimes even 5 cuts. Not quite, almost. There it is. And then we're going to start making our first flap. I'm going to check and make sure that's the right width. It is. I'm going to put my object right at the very bottom. Make a couple little pencil marks here, right at the ends. And then I'm going to score it using a bone folder. It's a good idea when you're not actually using your object to keep it well out of the way so that it doesn't have any harm come to it. To score with a bone folder, I kind of hold it with my index finger over the point, and then a couple of light presses here. Kind of reach under with your folder and go up against the back, and then finally fold it over and give it a really good hard press. And you want it to be a really solid crease. Can you see how square that is? That's exactly what you want it to look like. And the last thing I do is I put a number 1 right there. So I put a number 1 right here. I do it first because it helps keep me organized as I'm making the box. Second of all, it helps user-proof it. If all your flaps are marked, when you page it out to a patron, we're going to hope that they can look at flaps that are numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4 and figure out that's the order to fold them back in. And then we just kind of start working around the box, or working around the book. So, more little folds. So I have that, and we'll work it around. By the time you're done making this piece, you'll have made 4 creases. Sometimes it helps to count them as you go along. This last fold is a really good time where if you're not quite as square as you would like to be, you have an option to kind of straighten that out a little bit. So here comes my last crease. And you have to remember to keep this flap down, keep your 1 flap down, because every time you go around another piece of board, you're adding a little thickness. If I don't compensate for that, my box isn't going to fit correctly. One. So fantastic. I'm going to when you get to this point, this is where you stop making folds. You can think of it as having over the front of your book having 2 pieces of board. Mark it and trim off this flap. This one becomes 2. And 1, 2, and you have made the first 2 of your flaps on your 4 flap box. Next, we're going to cut a piece of board going the other direction with the grain. So the grain is still parallel to the spine of my book. And when you do this, remember to keep your object in the little case that you've just made, because it's now 2 thicknesses of board taller than it was when you started out. So I'm going to go and make 3, 4, however many pencil marks you feel like you need. The fewer you make, the fewer you might have to erase later on. And make sure that's perfect. With box making, any kind of box making, the hardest part of it is usually the accuracy of the measurement, trimming things to the right sizes, because since you keep adding board thicknesses, little mistakes multiply. So it's worth taking all the time that you need to really make sure your measurements are correct. But that, and I'm measuring in several places, that feels pretty good. And then what I do to make sure I get all my flaps folding in the right direction is I take my piece of board, put it over my 2, and label that edge 3. Okay? And it's the same process that we just did, except going the opposite direction. So I'm going to make a couple little marks and score and fold. And again, it's going to be 4 creases. So. And you may find on this one, because you're creasing with the grain, that it's actually easier to make the creases, and they look a little prettier because you're not folding through the fibers, you're kind of folding the same direction that they're going. Last one. There we go, let's see. And the last thing I need to do is trim this off. I don't have to mark this flap as 4, because if we've marked 1, 2, and 3, in theory, 4 is the only other option. And then the last thing we want to do is take a second and erase all those pencil marks that we've made with the Magic Rub eraser. The pencil won't chemically interact with whatever you're putting in your box, but if you're going to all the trouble to make a box, you want it to look as pretty as it possibly can. And there are the 2 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the next step will be to attach them together and make a closure. So we've made our two strips of board. I'm going to check the fit again before I start assembling things. I think I can make this one fit a little bit better if I trim a tiny bit off of my third flap. And that's something that happens to me fairly commonly. So I'm not going to measure it, I'm just going to eyeball and cut a little strip. Let's check it again. I do a lot of checking of measurements as I go along to make sure that everything fits properly so that if I have a problem, I don't finish the box and discover it then. But that fits a whole lot better. So now we're going to attach these two flaps together. I'm going to take my object out and put it somewhere safe and grab my tape. So this is 3M number 415 double-sided tape, which is the only acceptable tape to use. It's a good quality acrylic-based adhesive. You want to keep it in a bag. You never want to put it down on your workbench because the edges are sticky and they'll pick up any dirt or dust that you have on your workbench. So if you keep it in a plastic bag, it will always look nice. And I don't need a ton of tape. For something like this, I'm going to need 2 pieces. I'm going to put them kind of at the edges. You don't want to go all the way to the edge because this is an acrylic adhesive, and as it deteriorates, it will ooze. So if I go within about 1/4 of an inch of the edges, when it begins to ooze, it's not going to ooze out over the top of my box. I'll put that away where it's safe. Use my bone folder to make sure this is really good and stuck. And now we have to figure out how we're going to put everything together. There are lots of ways to do this, and I know people who do it tons of different ways, but I'm going to show you what works consistently for me. I'm going to peel off my tape, the tape backing, and if you have a hard time getting that with your fingernail, you can use a spatula or a scalpel or a knife. And I'm going to line up the box perfectly in this 3 flap and close the box around it. This tape is really strong, and once you've stuck it, you have no option except to move forward. There's no repositioning. So let's see. It worked. It fit. That's fantastic. So now you have a little structure that looks like this. So the last step we have to do is make a little closure for this, and it's the funnest part of the whole thing. I make this box so I get to make this closure. It is a tab and slit closure. The first thing we're going to make is the tab, and that's going to be in our flap that's the 4 that doesn't have a number on it. For larger boxes, you might want to get a 30, 60, 90 triangle to help with this, but for a small box like this, I'm just going to eyeball it and show you how I do that. I don't want to start directly at the crease when I start trimming into this, because if I trim into the crease, there's a bigger chance it's going to tear right there. So I'm going to start a little over, and I'm just going to eyeball it. Do something. What I'm trying to do is make the end of the tab as narrow as I can make it. And that looks pretty good. This is the super trick I have for you. To duplicate this, take this little corner you cut off, flip it over and put it in the corner here, draw a pencil line, and if I cut along that line, it's going to be the same angle both directions, and it's going to look really pretty. It's not going to affect the functionality if you have it slightly asymmetrical, but it won't look as nice. So there's my little slit, there's my tab. And I'm going to do one more thing to it. Right now, the tab is the same. It's going to hit my crease on the other side because it's the same width as my third 3 flap. So I'm going to cut off about 1/4 inch. And that way my tab won't bang into this crease. Because when the tab keeps banging into that crease, you run the risk of doing some damage to the box. So there's the tab. It's really cute. And we have to make our slit. So 1, 2, 3, 4. The slit is one of the primary points of weakness of this box. It's the thing that often breaks the most. So what we want to think about is a balance of how narrow or how wide we can make the distance from here to here, because the wider it is, the less chance it is that it'll break. But we want to make sure that there's enough room that the tab is going to stay shut. And I'm not particularly scientific about it. To me, this looks like a really good compromise. I'm going to put a pencil dot here and a pencil dot there. And just cut my little slit right from the middle of each pencil dot to the middle of the pencil dot. If you overcut on this, it's going to be easier for your tab to come out of the slit. So let's wrap it up and see how it works. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on. There. And then there's one last thing that we tend to do on these. Partly because it's aesthetics and partly because people enjoy doing it, but also it makes the box last longer. The corners are really sharp and tend to get banged up, so we're going to do some trimming on the corners. The 1 flap we don't ever trim because it covers the entire surface of your object. If we start taking material out of here and put this on a shelf with books applying pressure from both sides, you can get that pattern embossed into the cover of your book, which we don't want to do. So the 1 stays the same. But the 2 and the 3, we round the corners on. If you want to be really obsessive about it, you can get a dime and trace around the dime and put it in the corner. I don't do that. I just eyeball it like that. So cut off that corner and just round it. And that way the corner isn't going to get banged up as quickly. So there's the 3. There's the 2. And then on the 4, we're just going to gently soften these edges a tad, so there aren't any hard corners to get banged up. And it makes it look really pretty and finished. If you have some money to spend and you're going to get into a box making operation, it's worth investing in a corner rounder that can do this for you. They'll always be consistent that way, but this works. And there's your 4 flap box. You can put it on the shelf. Patrons can handle the box. It'll protect your object nicely. Thank you very much.